Well, let's get to our panel. With me here in the studio is Dennis Wilder. He is a former special assistant to U.S. President George W. Bush, and he is now the managing director of the Initiative for U.S. China Dialogue on Global Issues at Georgetown University. Joining me from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is an international relations expert and analyst. Also joining us from Philadelphia is Jacques deLisle. He is the professor and director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And with us here in Washington, too, is Zhang. He is Washington bureau chief and correspondent for the Shanghai Wen Hui Daily. Welcome to all of you to the show. Let's start with Victor in Beijing. And Victor, 2 days of talks. We heard some tough demands from both sides. What was accomplished? What's the view from China?
I think even though both sides have played it quite steadily, the overall impression here in Beijing is that it didn't achieve the expected result, and the two parties decided to walk away to report to their respective bosses and probably would need to re-engage with each other. This is actually a disappointment. However, if we look at what the U.S. side issued as a unilateral statement, the demand raised by the United States side is completely unacceptable by the Chinese side and wholly misrepresents the realities on the ground. And if the U.S. side really indulges in the fantasy that the conditions raised by the United States will be acceptable to the Chinese government, it is completely a fantasy to be dashed eventually. And in that case, the two sides probably will need to really go down the path of a major trade war between the two sides. And that's bad for China, that's bad for the United States, and that's bad for the world.
Dennis, as we had Victor tell us, the demands made by the United States completely unacceptable to the Chinese. But would it be fair to say that these are opening positions?
These are absolutely opening positions. But I do think the Chinese side has misunderstood something. We are now in the age of strategic competition between the United States and China. Trade is part of that strategic competition. What the Trump administration is saying is small deals aren't what we're looking for here. We're not looking for the old style of negotiation. We are looking for a systemic change in the economic relationship. That's big stuff. And they are not going for small gains. They are going for big gains. The question is, will this be a healthy competition, or is this going to be a disruptive and destructive competition?
The thing is, the position that both countries have taken up to now, up to the time that President Trump has taken over, is that this trade relationship has been a win-win.
Absolutely. It's been the anchor of the relationship.
Right. So it hasn't been competitive in that respect.
Right. That's what I'm saying. We're in a new era right now, and economic relations are part of the overall competition between the United States and China. And so these trade negotiations are getting rougher. They are getting tougher, and Beijing has to understand that this administration is going to be tough on this subject.
Song, China's news agency Xinhua reported that China and the United States reached agreement on some issues, but there are some big differences that remain. What did China achieve with these talks, and do you see any positives coming out of it?
Not really, because there was no joint announcement coming out from this meeting, and I will say, if you look at the 8-point demands proposed by Chinese side, I think it's kind of more balanced. I think the two sides agreed that China can purchase more goods from America, and China can open its own market more, and China will reduce tariff on many U.S. products, especially like automobile. I think this kind of areas are the basic kind of meeting points of the two sides. But I will say the biggest part of this negotiation is that they are having tremendous differences.
But, you know, to Dennis's point, that these are the opening positions. Yes. I mean, that's what they're going to be negotiating. Right?
I think Mr. Trump is bringing the policy, the strategy of maximum pressure from a DPRK issue to this trade issue between U.S. and China. And he believed that this kind of maximum pressure policy is going to work. This is my demand. It may be very astonishing to you, but let us talk. And I will say this is a start of a long negotiation. It won't be very sweet, but I'm hopeful that finally we will get a win-win situation again.
Okay, let's bring in Jacques deLisle. He's in Philadelphia. And Jacques, a big issue for the United States, protection of U.S. technology, intellectual property rights. The U.S. has made much of that. What do you see as the major challenges in these talks?
Well, certainly the intellectual property rights have been a focus for the U.S., but that needs to be unpacked a little bit. There's a range of issues here, from cyber espionage and theft of intellectual property rights to concerns about China's level of protection for intellectual property rights, both foreign and domestic, to the so-called coerced transfers, that is, arrangements whereby U.S. firms that want to do business in China have to agree to the transfer of rights. Those are all legitimate concerns, but they're to different degrees amenable to the kind of discussions you can have in these kinds of negotiations, certainly where WTO issues are in the background. But I think part of what's made this so difficult in engaging the U.S. in this is that there's something of a laundry list of demands. Yes, opening positions which are quite expansive, but I think there's also a certain lack of coherence to the U.S. position. I think it's not clear to the Chinese or to many Americans exactly where the intellectual property rights fit in the broader complex of market access and investment and the Made in China 2025 support for high-tech industries.
Dennis, do you agree? Lack of coherence?
I don't agree. There is a coherence to this. What the administration is trying to say to China is, look, certain of your national policies, certain of your economic policies have disrupted this relationship. For example, the subsidies that you give to companies are too great and last too long, and it creates things like overcapacity in steel. We need a different kind of deal. Unfortunately, the WTO doesn't seem to be a venue where we can work these things out, because we haven't moved the WTO into the 21st century because the Doha round failed. Now we are going outside of the WTO to try and negotiate this with China. It's a difficult negotiation because China has some very legitimate interests in creating national champions, in creating a 21st century economy with great AI capabilities in all these areas. So when the administration comes in and says to the Chinese, you have to change national policies, that's a pretty tough ask.
Let me get Victor's response on that. Victor?
Now, first of all, allow me to disagree a little bit. First of all, if, as our distinguished American panelist mentioned, if the United States says to China, I want to be tough, be tough. It doesn't matter to China. If the United States wants to be tough against China, China will be tough against the United States. If the United States wants to really launch a trade war, China will follow through the trade war with the United States. What do we get by the end of that process? Destruction. Destruction of American interest, destruction of the Chinese interest, destruction of the global trade. No country in the world should be allowed to put itself outside of the WTO framework while being a member of WTO and trampling the principles of the WTO. The battle between China and the United States is a battle to protect the integrity of the WTO or to undermine and erode and destroy WTO. The United States is not a god. It cannot say to China or the rest of the world, I'm the god, listen to me, kowtow to me. That's not to be acceptable to the Chinese government and to the Chinese people. The national industrial policy of China is to be defined and decided by China itself. The United States has no say in the national industrial policy of China. So, if the U.S. delegation comes to China with the expectation that it can dictate the terms to the Chinese national industrial policy, that's a fantasy, that's a misleading fantasy engaged by the United States, and it's misleading its president, and it's misleading the consumers and the corporate side in the United States. It's misleading the whole world. Wake up, the United States. Wake up to the reality. China is not to be bullied. China will stand firm on the principle. If you want to launch a trade war, we will follow through with a trade war with the United States. That's the position taken by the Chinese government. And I think the Chinese people and the Chinese corporates rally behind the Chinese government's firm position.
Jacques, what is your view on that? I mean, we've heard that there are problems with the WTO and the way it operates. Shouldn't the aim be to fix the WTO rather than work outside it?
Well, I think we're in a period when the WTO is in some trouble. We're seeing these mega regional agreements like the TPP, which the U.S. has opted out of, and the RCEP, the more China-centric one. So those are symptoms of broader dissatisfaction with the WTO as a mechanism for handling a lot of these issues. There are a couple of pieces here that I think need to be unpacked in response to what Victor said. There are some issues, some of the more serious issues between the United States and China, that WTO mechanisms don't do a great job of reaching. Yes, the WTO has a significant intellectual property rights component, but it doesn't get at some of these kinds of coerced transfers, as U.S. businesses would describe them. It's not very good at getting a lot of investment-related issues, and it's also not all that good at getting at industrial policy, which involve government subsidies where they don't cross the line into the kind of subsidies that the WTO deals with. So in those respects, I think I do disagree with Victor somewhat, but the way the Trump administration has gone into this, I think, has, in a sense, weakened the hand the U.S. might otherwise play. The critique of the U.S. as being a bully and going it alone is in part because the U.S. has not built the kind of alliances and the kind of common cause with other states that have somewhat similar complaints. And the U.S. has come in on its initial list of demands with this rather bizarre $200 billion target for reducing a trade deficit, which is completely orthogonal. It doesn't line up with the way trade law works or even with the way the underlying economies work. To cast this all as a bilateral trade deficit is just to mistake the underlying economics that we're dealing with here.
Dennis, what's your view on this, and especially to Victor's point on this process being fraught with risks? It could hurt both sides. Yeah, in fact, there was a letter that was signed by 1,100 economists here in the United States warning President Trump of the dangers of these tariff-heavy approaches.
Right. Well, this president is a disruptor. He has disrupted Washington. He has disrupted Beijing. His style is to gamble. His style is to take high risk for what he believes could be high reward. So is his style very different in these negotiations from anything we've seen before from an American president? Absolutely. Do I find it sometimes a little unnerving myself, such as the $200 billion figure? Yes. But we are dealing with a president who has had some success. We're going to talk in a minute about the Korea issue. He has had some success with a high-risk strategy, and he's trying to see whether he can have some success with a high-risk strategy in this situation as well.
Okay, so I want to stay with the trade talks for a moment there. And, the United States has been very, they've looked at this in detail. They've targeted certain things. For instance, the sanctions, very harsh sanctions imposed on the Chinese telecom equipment maker ZTE. Now, they want those sanctions eased. That particular company was hit with a 7-year ban on U.S. companies selling components to it. How does China look at that? How important is that for China?
I think in China there are two different voices at the same time. A group of Chinese experts were saying that ZTE has its own problem. They had some illegal dealing with Iranian government and with North Korean government, which has been banned by the U.S. government. And so the U.S. government is just executing its own authority, and so it's a reasonable punish. But another group of experts are believing the intention is not only to punish ZTE, but also to disturb or delay the development of IT industry, especially in 5G communication technology in China. So I think it's going to be a very tough battle between U.S. and China. In the future, the two governments can reach some more broad understanding on technology and this issue, and ZTE will finally get to be like unlisted from this punishment again, and they are able to import chips and softwares from America.
Right. Victor, what's your view on that? I mean, these are very finely targeted punitive measures taken here by the United States. How does China overcome that? I mean, what leverage does China have?
Allow me to make several points. First of all, yes, indeed, ZTE had some problems which need to be addressed. They were already fined in the range of 1.1 to 1.2 billion US dollars, and they have paid about $900 million fine. They will pay the remaining portion, I suppose, and they still have some problems which need to be corrected. However, the U.S. decision to refuse any exports of the chips, for example, to ZTE is definitely an overkill. Whatever measure that the United States has come up with is not proportional to the problems and the mistakes ZTE could be found guilty of. Therefore, I think the United States cannot create the image that it is practicing overkill in dealing with companies like ZTE. That's number one. Number two is that the Chinese government already officially raised this very serious problem involving ZTE and the U.S. punishment of ZTE in the important discussions in Beijing. And the U.S. side already said they will report this directly to President Donald Trump. So hopefully President Donald Trump will have a second look at this situation, avoid overkill of ZTE. That's the important thing.
Okay. Dennis, there has been, well, I could say the favor has been returned by the Chinese. They've targeted American farmers.
Yes.
And we've just heard that, you know, the Chinese have stopped buying soybeans from American producers. What do you make of that? I mean, is this...
I think the farm states are very upset at this point. They want to trade with China. They want those markets, obviously, and their fear is once they lose those markets to other parts of the world, they'll never come back. And so I think those people are the leading edge of the worst fear that people have, which is in this process, do we disengage from each other? I hope not. I hope in this process we can find a new way to engage with each other effectively. But there is the danger, if we get into a trade war, that China, for example, on the ZTE problem, will build its own semiconductor industry. They've already talked about putting $47 billion into it. Is that good for global trade? Is that efficient? There's already an industry in the United States that China can buy from. My fear about this administration is the protectionist sort of sentiment of the administration.
Jacques, I mean, we're talking about the United States and China here, but what kind of impact could this dispute have on international trade?
Well, when you've got the two gigantic trading parties that the U.S. and China are, any disruption in that relationship, of course, is almost by definition a direct impact of significant scale on international trade. But we're also living in a world of global supply chains and global value chains. One of the reasons that the bilateral U.S.-China trade deficit is not a very good measure of the overall economic situation is that things are counted as imports to the U.S. and exports from China based on the value that they have when they leave the dock in China. And of course, much of that value is created through the inputs that come into China and are assembled there. That the landscape has changed some, but that's still a big part of it. So if you start having these kinds of barriers to Chinese exports to the U.S., then you wind up disrupting those global supply chains, and we're going to see a very difficult adjustment. Maybe production will move somewhere else. Maybe American consumers will just take the hit and increase prices. But it really is something that is not just bilateral. It has ripple effects around the world as production may have to shift and as countries seek substitutes for the goods that are facing higher tariffs now.
Song, very quickly, before I move on to the nuclear issue, do you think progress can be made, or is there danger this could unravel from what is now a dispute into a trade war?
I would be hopeful finally we will get a very good deal. And I think Mr. Trump is not working toward a kind of trade war with China. He's a businessman. He wanted to work good for American people. And China is realizing that a trade war is no benefit for them. So I think the first meeting is not so good, but they will continue to work.
Okay. We are going to change topics right now, move to another story involving China. Earlier this week, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yis visited the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and met with its leader, Kim Jong-un. How important was that? Well, let's take a look at this. Victor, I'm going to start with you again. And we also had the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who had a discussion with the South Korean leader Moon Jae-in. But looking at Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to the DPRK, he was very upbeat. He said that the recent talks that had taken place between the leaders of the two Koreas had brought beneficial opportunities for a political solution to this dispute. Question is, how does China move that process forward?
First of all, I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to DPRK is a very important landmark visit. Why? Because the Chinese Foreign Minister has not set foot on DPRK for many, many years. So in a sense, it is a breakthrough for the foreign ministry. It's a breakthrough for the Chinese foreign minister. And that means relations have become normal between the Chinese foreign ministry and the foreign minister with DPRK government, including its supreme leader. And secondly, I would say the foreign minister, Wang Yis, made all the right points to the DPRK side, as well as in his discussions and dialogue with Supreme Leader Mr. Kim, to address all the issues and to follow up on what has been agreed between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the DPRK Supreme Leader. So I think it's a very important step in normalizing the relations between DPRK and China, especially involving the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
Dennis, it would seem that there are many risks for the United States in this process that we're seeing in trying to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. President Trump is scheduled to meet with the DPRK leader, Kim Jong-un. In fact, he said this morning that a time and place that's already been set. We don't know that yet. It hasn't been made public. But what's the best case scenario for the United States? I mean, if President Trump goes and has a meeting, can he afford to walk away empty-handed?
No, and he won't. I think we are on the verge of a grand bargain between the United States and North Korea that will have momentous effect on the world situation. I think that China has been a big help to the President of the United States in getting us to this point. And I think the President in his tweets and his statements has made very clear that he understands that China is part of the solution here. So whereas earlier we talked about strategic competition in this age, this is strategic cooperation. And what's interesting about the U.S.-China relationship, unlike the Russian relationship with the United States, both can coexist. It's tough to do. It's a tricky situation between the two countries. It's not simple. But we are actually seeing strategic cooperation on Northeast Asia that may change the shape of geopolitics in the region.
Zhang, we've had the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un say that he's open to the idea of getting rid of all the nuclear weapons that he had. We also had the South Korean leader, Moon Jae-in. He was talking about awarding the Nobel Prize to President Trump for his efforts. Seriously, though, I mean, could we see the grand bargain that Dennis is talking about? It's been called a Big Bang solution down there to resolve what's been an issue that's lasted decades.
I am optimistic, and I think there can be a very big win-win situation for China, U.S., North Korea, and also South Korea. And people usually are skeptical that Mr. Kim Jong-un may not be sincere to give up its nuclear weapons. But I'm relatively optimistic because I think if China, America, South Korea, and other parties are sincere enough to reward North Korea peace and the stability and the prosperity, I don't see the reason why he will be rejecting a kind of final solution.
Right. And if it does happen, it does send a very powerful message to the rest of the world on what multilateral negotiations can achieve.
I think so, because especially I think Foreign Minister Wang Yis is already talking with Kim about post-denuclearization scenario in the peninsula. I think China will be ready to have a lot of economic cooperation with North Korea if they will finally denuclearize themselves.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.